A lot of you probably recognize this little symbol. It's the symbol for Siri on your phone, on your iPhone. And many times I just pick up the phone and say, "Hey Siri," and I ask a question and it tells me. It tells me the answer. I understand that. I'm asking the question. I'm starting and initiating this conversation. When I go on Google and I search for a product or anything like that, I know that from then on for several weeks, on Facebook, on Google, anything else that I go to, that is already going to be putting ads about what I search for. That's inevitable. But once again, I'm the one who initiated that. But I'll tell you what's kind of weird to me, what's kind of Twilight Zone-ish to me, is when ads pop up or things pop up on Facebook or all of a sudden in my feed, and my Google search or whatever, that I've never searched for. The first time I ever noticed that happening, a friend and I were just sitting and talking about this golf resort that we'd always wanted to go to and how I'd like to go there. And he was the same way. And we just sat and we talked about this for a long time. The very next day, I've never looked up that resort. I've never done it. There was an advertisement on my Facebook feed to go to this golf course, to go to this resort and stay at this hotel. I mean, that kind of struck me as weird. But if it was just one time, that would be just a coincidence. But there's been multiple times that I would be having a conversation with somebody or talk on the phone, and the next thing you know, these ads pop up. It wasn't too long ago I was just talking about number 2 pencils to somebody over the phone. I didn't research number 2 pencils, but guess what my Amazon ad was the next day? For number 2 pencils. I mean, I don't know how to explain this. It just seems awfully strange to me. A friend of mine dropped his computer. It fell right out of his bag, hit the table, crashed down on the floor. It kept working, everything was fine, but he said the next day, Amazon had sent him an ad. Do you want to buy a cover for your computer? He said he didn't know if they're spying on him or a computer told on him. But it's just kind of strange. You know, last week we saw the example of knowing the heart of a king. How God knows the heart and how he encourages us to not look on the outside but to judge by the heart. God looked at King Saul and he worked with him for years and years, but finally he drew the conclusion. He said, "Saul, I'm finished with you. I know that you're not going to turn back to me." He made a judgment of the heart, a judgment that you and I can't make, but he encourages us to look past the surface just as well. When he sent his prophet Samuel to find a new king, to anoint a new king to take Saul's place, you remember he sent him to the house of Jesse, and this is what it says, instruction he gave him. "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." An earthly king for Israel was never God's idea. It was never his plan. It wasn't a good idea because God was to be their king. And putting this much power into one person never turns out to be good. If you just study your history a little bit, back in the Middle Ages, the church became so powerful that they became corrupt. They didn't follow the scriptures. They controlled governments, and they became a very corrupt part of history. Not a good thing. Rather, when God gave us plans, when Jesus gave us plans for his church, he said, doesn't need to be with one man. He said, choose out from among you elders, those to serve, so that the power is spread out. It's not centered on one man, but then follow those people that you've chosen to lead your church. But the reality of the situation for Israel, even though it was not a good idea, was that they had started down the road of having earthly kings over the nation. Saul, a total disappointment. But with God's new king, David, he has said he would be a man after my own heart. And our core 52 verse for this week is in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. But before I go there and read that, it's important to know the context, because context is important in any communication. All right, David is already the king. And one of the things that he wants to do is to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, to bring it to Jerusalem. And if we read that account there, we see that David is so excited that he leads the procession of bringing the Ark back to Jerusalem. And it says he was dancing and singing, he even took his outer coat, his robe off, and was just dancing, leading the whole progression. And as they come into Jerusalem, his wife looks out the window from the palace and is embarrassed that David is acting this way. And when David comes back into the house, back into his palace, she lets him have it. And she says, you have really embarrassed yourself. You've embarrassed me by the way you've acted here. We're going to see a little insight into David's heart when he says this to his wife. He says, I will celebrate before the Lord. I'll become even more undignified than this. And I will be humiliated in my eyes. You know, in other words, David is saying, I don't care what you think. I don't care what people think. I'm going to celebrate with the Lord. I'm going to follow God with all of my heart. And if I want to the jump and dance and sing, I'm going to do that. And he says, and even if it makes me look foolish to some people, I don't care. It's between me and God. Well, we get another insight right after this happens there in 2 Samuel chapter 7, starting with verse 1. It says this, after the king had settled into his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, this is David speaking to Nathan, he says, here I am, living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. And he wants to build God something better than a tent. You can't keep God in any kind of building, but he did say that would be my name, could reside there. That's what would represent me. And he wants to build something nice. And you would think God would say, yes, David, go right ahead. But he tells Nathan to relay this message back to David, and he says, no, David, I don't want you to build me a house, a temple. I don't want it, but I tell you what I do want to build. I want to build you a great name. I want to build you a dynasty. I want to give you a great family. Saul wanted to build monuments to himself. David wants to build monuments to God. And God says, I want to build a great name for you. He says, and I want you to know this too, David, you're not a failure. Because I'm going to make things great for you. It's just not the right timing here. Don't worry because, and he goes on in verses 12 and 13 saying, when your days are over and you rest with your fathers, in other words, when you die, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. Who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So often in God's prophecies, when he delivers something like this, it has a dual meaning. There's the immediate and the ultimate. In the immediate, we quickly understand he's talking about Solomon, because Solomon became the next king. He was the son of David, and he became a great and wealthy king. And he built the temple. God said, it's time. You will build the temple for me. But ultimately, the fulfillment of the rest is that you see that would last forever, the kingdom would last forever. This is a promise that Jesus kept. For Jesus was born right out of the line of David. You know, these verses tell us a lot about David. No wonder God chose him. No wonder God loved him so much, because he had that heart to do for God and to do for other people. He chose him through which Jesus, the line of David, that Jesus would be born from. And when God said, I will make you a great name, you really need to read this section. It is some beautiful writing, some wonderful things to read and to ponder on. So I encourage you to read this whole section. But when he told him he would make him a great name, do you know that David's name is used in the Bible over 900 times? 900 times. 10 times in the Gospels Jesus is referred to, or he refers to himself as the Son of David. In other words, he's saying, I came from the line of David. No wonder David is such a key figure in the history and the story that God wanted to tell the world. But these verses also tell us a lot about God. God keeps his promises. You know, what he says he's going to do, he's going to do. And when God finds a person who has a heart after him, a God who wants to look after God, a person who wants to look after God, God says, I'll look after you. I'll provide for you. You know, royalty, kings, I mean, you can study this. I did some reading on it. You can study this. And every king, every dynasty, whether it's an evil king or a good king, they're always concerned about who will be the heir to the throne. Who will keep all of this going? And they want to make sure that they have someone, a son, a daughter, to fulfill that, to carry on what they had started. And God puts David's mind at ease here. And he says, just because I'm not letting you build me a house, a temple right now, I want you to know that your kingdom will reign forever. And that your sons will sit upon there. And then the greatest ultimately will carry it on. If you make your dreams God's dreams, if you will pursue God before you pursue your dreams, God will always take care of you. God can do amazing things with our little dreams when we'll just turn them over to him, when we'll just make him the desire of our hearts. David Smallbone lived in Australia, and he felt God's calling to promote Christian concerts there in Australia. Even though only 5% of the population were Christians. But he still pursued that, and when everything went bad and the stadiums were not filled, he found that he was in debt for $250,000. His creditors came in and repossessed his home. He lost everything. But in the midst of that, an artist, a top artist in Nashville, Tennessee, offered him a job. And so David and his family of 6 loaded up everything and came to America and settled in Nashville, Tennessee. But it wasn't too long after settling there that he found out that the job that had been offered was no longer available. And he was at the end of his rope, and he said he and his wife and children sat down, they got on their knees, and they prayed for God's help. God, show us what to do. And then things began to happen. Bags of groceries would show up. Someone gave them a van that they could use to travel. Odd jobs would pop up so it could make ends meet. But then the hugest thing that just seemed to come out of the blue was someone offered his daughter, his 15-year-old daughter, a recording contract. Rebecca was her name, and instead of taking Smallbone as her performing name, she chose an old name from the family's past, St. James. Probably a lot of you have heard of Rebecca St. James. She went on to record many albums. Her father, went on to promote her concerts. She won a Grammy Award, won several Dove Awards. And now, Rebecca joins her brothers occasionally in their own band to perform with them. Maybe you've heard of For King and Country. It is amazing what God will do when we turn our dreams over to him. Now, these verses also tell us some things about Jesus. They tell us some important things about him. Have you ever wondered about those boring list of names that's at the beginning of several of the Gospels? This name after name. And where they may not mean a whole lot to us, they're there to prove that God's prophecy about Jesus was true. That he did come from the house and the lineage of David. It was proof that he was who he said he was. David was a great king. His son Solomon was a great king. Both of them reigned for 40 years each. 40 years each. But that doesn't make them a forever king. It doesn't make them an eternal king. David was a man after God's own heart. Jesus literally had the heart of God. No more chasing after him. He was the heart of God. Now I want to look at several things here as we keep moving through this wonderful idea of David's heart, God's heart, and the prophecy that has been fulfilled through Jesus. When the angel Gabriel came to Mary, you remember, to announce about Jesus' birth, it says this in Luke 1:31. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you'll give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, there it is again, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end. Echoing that same promise, line of David, forever a king. When Jesus was arrested and he stood before Pilate on that night, and he was arrested on all kinds of trumped up charges, and one was that he was trying to cause an insurrection by claiming to be a king. And so Pilate called him in and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered this way. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. And Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born. And for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." What difference does it make to us and all of this that we've read and things that go back thousands of years old? It tells us that Jesus is king. That Jesus has the authority. That he is in the rightful place. That he is eternal and his reign is forever. And that we are part of the kingdom of God. We are citizens of a kingdom of Jesus. You know, being that our church here is located on the major road that runs through our county, we get some interesting people stop by sometimes. The other day, a total stranger, came into my office and said, "Hey, is that your truck out there?" And you know, I got a new truck, you know, and so he says, "Is that your truck out there?" And I said, "Well, yes, it is." He says, "I got to tell you, I need to use your truck." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Yeah, I haven't got time to explain now. Just give me the keys. I'll come back later with it, but I got to have your truck." What do you think I did? Well, before you answer that, let me go and tell you this. That is a totally made up story. That did not happen. I totally made every part of that up. But I made it up because when I was reading this, it made me think of this story here. The final week that Jesus was alive on this earth, he was going into Jerusalem, what we call the triumphant entry. And it says this about him in Mark 11, starting with verse 1. It says, "As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, 'Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' tell them, 'The Lord needs it, and he will send it back here shortly.'" You know, it's obvious that these people knew and had heard of Jesus, or they wouldn't have let two strangers take this colt away. And by the way, this is just a fulfillment of another prophecy of how the king, the Messiah, would enter into Jerusalem. But there had to be some type of relationship. Can I go back to the totally made up story of just a few minutes ago? If a total stranger walks in and says, "I need your truck," I'm going to say no. But if someone walks in and says, "Hey man, Dolan needs your truck. Hey, Eric needs your truck. Hey, Anybody else that I have a relationship with, I need your truck, I'll explain later. You know what I'd do? I'd hand them the keys. Why? Because I have a relationship with those people. And if they say they need it, then they need it. No questions asked. We'll settle all of that later. Relationship. Jesus is my Lord. He is my Savior. He is my King. And that makes me a citizen of His kingdom. And as a citizen, it is my place, my obligation, my duty, my love to give Him anything that He needs. I remember in the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy once said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." You and I are citizens of the greatest kingdom there will ever be. The only kingdom that will last forever. If the King ever needs anything from us, then we need to respond with a yes. A wholehearted yes. Here it is. You know, up until this week, I never heard the name of Chiyune Sugihara. Chiyune Sugihara. But his story is quite remarkable. He was a citizen of Japan and worked for the government of Japan. And his aspirations had been he wanted to travel, he wanted to work in like as an ambassador of his country, particularly wanted to go to Russia. And he was a bright, rising star within this area, and had done some great things already. And in the late 1930s, he was sent to open up a consulate office there in Lithuania, which was strategically between Germany and Russia. And with World War II about to break out, they wanted someone there that could possibly be there to help relay any war information, any war plans. In Lithuania, before the start of the war, there were 120,000 Polish Jews, ones who had fled there to escape persecution. And when the war did finally break out, at first they thought they were safe there, but it soon became very apparent that that Lithuania would fall and they would go into the hands of the Jews, or into the hands of the Nazis. And they were desperate to find a way out. And with working with diplomats and stuff, they found out that the only escape was to go through Russia into Japan, and then Japan would let them go to other countries. Russia agreed, but said the only way you can travel through our country is if you have a legal visa from the nation of Japan. Sugihara woke up one morning in late July 1940, and the consulate was surrounded by crowds of Jews who were looking to obtain visas to escape. 3 times he contacted Tokyo and asked if he could write these visas. 3 times he was told, absolutely not. Do not do this. There's nothing more to be said about it. And he was left with the decision to save the lives of these people or to face imprisonment himself and at the least lose his career and go back home in disgrace. For the next 28 days before he was called back to Tokyo, Sugihara and his wife began to handwrite travel visas for these Jews, night and day. Never just stopping long enough to eat as he continued to write these visas and to grab a little sleep. 28 days. And it said even as he was leaving on the train, he was writing and handing them out the windows to the people. Nearly 6,000 visas were written by his hand. He went back to Tokyo and of course lost his career. Did not go to jail, but lost his career. But he was not totally forgotten. 45 years later, Sugihara his story was told, and the Israeli government gave him the highest medal of honor that there can be given to a citizen, and they gave it to him, and they named a street in one of their towns after him. When he was asked about it in 1985, he said they were human beings and they needed help. I'm glad I found the strength to make a decision to give it to them. He said, I may have had to disobey my government, but if I didn't, I would be disobeying God. My prayer for you is the same it is for me, is that we will find the courage, like a man like Sugihara, that will put his eternal king ahead of any other king or kingdom. And may you find that strength to serve him this day and every day. God bless you. And we look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.